from all sorts of backgrounds, online, on newspaper forums, etc. And one thing that I've been noticing is that whilst there's widespread condemnation of Russia's actions, there's also a relatively small but very vocal group of people on the forums that I have seen who are pro-Putin. What I find interesting about these people is they, in many cases, are not Russians. They are often Westerners, and by that I mean Britons, Americans, predominantly. I'm talking about the people that I've come across. Now, for me, I do have a question mark about these people, and I'd like to explain why. It seems to me that whenever there is a major international incident, or the beginning of something, a beginning of a conflict, which sadly it looks like this is going to be the case with Ukraine, there are always people who will take the attitude of blame the West first, no matter what the situation is, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the situation. There seems to be people with a mindset of blame the West first. And I do find it tiresome that a lot of these people are Westerners. Now, I find it tiresome because living in the West, they should have some grasp of the sort of relative freedoms that we enjoy in Western countries. And so I find there's something very hypocritical in their stance about vilifying the West whilst ignoring the many good things about the West. Now, of course, it's not just about what's happening in Western society. They would say, oh, this isn't about what's going on in the West, it's about Western foreign policy. But the problem is their obsessive focus on Western moral wrongs, and goodness knows there has been moral wrongs in Western foreign policy, and I should at this point out that it's probably misguided to talk about Western foreign policy like it's always unanimous. It's not a case that the US and the UK are always on the same side. I mean, look at Suez in the 50s. We were on different sides at that point. In Iraq, France and America had very strong disagreements. So it's not always the case that Western countries are unanimous. So that's an important point to make. But what I'm getting at is, it seems no matter what the situation, there are people who will have a conspiracy theory in their mindset, i.e., oh, the CIA is involved, it's some sort of covert operation, etc. Now, what I would argue is, in this world, of course, when you have a superpower like the United States, the Americans are going to have their fingers in a lot of pies. That, to put it one way, goes without saying. So I'm not here to say that Western countries are blameless. I'm not saying that. What I do question, however, is their utter lack of objectivity. And what I mean by that is they're so willing to attack the country that they're from. Essentially, if you want to look at it in an infantile manner, to attack their own side. Although I'm reluctant to use that sort of terminology because it's sort of like, then that makes me look like a blind nationalist, like, oh, us and them. I don't want to take that sort of attitude, but it does seem that I do question people who constantly vilify their own country whilst turning a blind eye to things that other countries are doing. Now, what these people, in my opinion, are doing, what's actually going on is they're so blinded by their opposition to Western foreign policy that they are actually ignorant about what Russia is doing. And they've allowed themselves to be ignorant because they are looking for sources that vindicate their own opinion. Sources such as Russia Today, which is, I've mentioned before, my utter contempt for that network. It's a complete nationalist mouthpiece. And if you look at the sort of agenda of its editors, the sort of extreme nationalism that comes from Russia Today editors behind the doors, and these have been leaked occasionally, then you'll see what the real agenda is. Now, no doubt they will turn around and say, oh well, the BBC, CNN, etc. are just as bad. What I would say in response to that is, sure, every media network probably has a bias. I'm not so stupid as to think that there isn't bias in those networks as well. But there is one difference, and that is that they are not slavishly pro-government in the same way. You can't say the BBC is slavishly in favour of the British government. That is simply not the case. In fact, the British government, the current British government, will probably argue it's biased against them. So it's wrong. That I think is a very critical difference. Russia today will never criticise Putin. Or at least if they do, it will be very, very muted. So what we have here is a situation whereby they are looking at what they want them to look at. I have followed this situation from the very start, way back to Euromaidan. Now, I don't know everything. I'm not there, I'm not on the ground, I don't know everything. But when people come in and say things that, oh, this is the EU and the West meddling, I think, where have you been for the last 6 months? It isn't the EU that violently annexed part of a sovereign state. It isn't the EU that fired at unarmed soldiers, as Russia did. And by the way, Putin has been lying, so is Lavrov, about their stance from the start. What I mean by that is they insisted there was no Russian troops on the ground. Guess what? A week later, they went, oh yeah, maybe that was our guys. So clearly there's been an inconsistency from the Russian side. That alone should raise question marks about what is really going on in Ukraine. Let's look at the current crisis. Now, Russia is using the situation in Odessa, that terrible fire, to try and make it look like Ukraine is responsible for this whole mess. I don't know what happened in the fire. It may well be that that was a massacre at the hand of neo-Nazis, Ukrainian neo-Nazis. I wasn't there, I don't know. But this particular conflict, let's be clear about this, started when separatists violently overtook parliament buildings. That's the origins of this conflict. Now, Russia done nothing to stop them, even though they were fiercely pro-Russia. If Putin was really interested in slowing down this crisis, he could have stepped in and said, I know you're pro-Russia, but don't use violence. Putin could have used his influence and power, and let's be clear, he's probably the most powerful man in the world right now, but he didn't. It's pretty clear to me that from the start of this crisis, and I mean the broader Ukraine crisis, Russia has done absolutely nothing to de-escalate the situation. It's done the exact opposite. It's escalated at every turn through scaremongering rhetoric. It hasn't been based on facts, because independent UN reports, for example, the Russian claim to justify their illegal annexation, which by the way was based on a corrupt referendum. This referendum they keep mentioning was in the context of a military occupation whereby Ukrainians were threatened. This is something that people who are pro-Putin keep overlooking. They say, oh, look at the referendum, that's democracy. It was completely undemocratic because the Ukrainian side was basically shut up. It was not a fair referendum. Anyway, to get back to my point, Russia has been escalating this from the start. That seems pretty obvious to me. Now, the UN made a report on the Russian claims that Russian speakers were being threatened. That may well be the case now, but I'm talking about at the time of the Crimean annexation. Russia justified that on the grounds that the Russian minority was being threatened, which, by the way, so did Hitler do in the 30s to justify annexation of the Sudetenland. That's just a historical fact. But anyway, an independent UN report looked into that. What they found was there were incidents of aggression against the Russian minority, but the very critical thing was that was not systemic, it was not widespread. That's very important, because what you had at that time was not state persecution of the Russian minority, It was isolated incidents. Yes, probably by neo-Nazis. But you could get exactly the same in any country. I mean, under that logic, there's plenty of African countries could take issue with Russia for the racist attacks on West African students in Moscow or St. Petersburg. Russia's in no position to lecture anybody about racism. I just think that's incredible. For one of the most racist countries in the world in terms of treatment of minorities, to lecture another country about racism is just ironic. Russia's a very serious problem with neo-Nazi gangs. So for them to... I'm sure Ukraine's far from squeaky clean, but my point is Russia's in no position to lecture. And let's look at Russia in recent history. If Russia really cares about self-determination and democracy, my question is, okay, give the Chechens a referendum. Give people in Dagestan a referendum. Clearly the Russian attitude isn't consistent, and clearly this fits into Putin's agenda. This is a man who is on record as saying that perestroika, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. It's pretty obvious that Putin has been hell-bent on reclaiming Russian glory. Because from his perspective, Russia was humiliated in 1991. So I honestly believe what Putin is doing is trying to rebuild a greater Russia. And he's using this thing about Russian minorities being threatened as an excuse. Now, unfortunately, what's happening now is this situation's got so out of hand, largely because Russia has escalated it, that sadly there's no going back. And I hate to say it, but I think we're going to see a very bloody civil war, similar to the breakup of Yugoslavia. And it pains me to say that, because as a European, I don't want to see this in Europe. But unfortunately it's got so bad now, and there's been suffering on both sides, that there's no going back. And probably there has been a lot of I don't know what happened in Odessa. There has to be an independent investigation into that. It may well be that Ukrainian neo-Nazis were responsible for that massacre, but even without checking the facts, Russia Today had as their headlines, blasting out these headlines about Odessa massacre, and of course immediately blaming Ukrainians without actually checking the context of what happened. Now that's dangerous. It's scaremongering. It may be accurate, I don't know, but that shows just how dangerous that sort of broadcasting is. And like I said, there probably is bias on both sides, but I do think Russia Today has been far less objective than some Western media outlets. Because from what I've seen, Western media outlets have interviewed people from both sides. RT, what it always does is it handpicks guests they know are going to agree with them and fit into their agenda, and they bring on conspiracy theorists who will blame Washington and London for absolutely everything. Because don't you know MI5 and the CIA wiped out the dinosaurs? Were you aware of that? But seriously, I honestly think this is what RT does. It brings on people they know will agree with them. Now, the BBC and CNN, I don't even mention Fox, I think Fox is a joke, but the BBC and CNN are biased, of course they are. And I'm not here to go out of my way to defend them. But I'm looking at this situation, I have been looking at this situation from a wide variety of sources. Not just the BBC and CNN. I have watched RT reports, just to balance things out, and to hear the other side. And I'm just not convinced. I've watched the reports, and all I see is West evil, Russia righteous. That's their attitude. And it's not only unprofessional, it's actually dangerous, because what they're doing is stirring up the fans of war. And like I say, it's hard to see any going back at this point. You know, Russia could have turned this situation around when there was peace talks in Geneva a few weeks ago, I can't remember exactly, but I can't remember the exact date, Russia could have used its influence at that point to say to those separatists in eastern Ukraine, okay, you've made your point, we will press for your rights, but don't use violence, don't violently take over parliament buildings. Russia did nothing to stop them doing that. Now that makes me think that Russia has an agenda, and I wouldn't be half surprised if Russia had people on the ground, mercenaries, stirring things up. In fact, there were people in Russian military uniforms saying this is Russia and we're going to reclaim it. So I'll just conclude with one thing. I believe that Russia has been largely responsible for escalating this situation. You don't have to agree with me, but that's my perspective. And I seriously hope it de-escalates, but unfortunately I believe this has went too deep now. And I think we're going to see another Yugoslavia.